this term equals this term. But then it was also reading through with that careful eye and looking for things like connotation or additional description that really couldn't be substantiated by what was in the collection. And that requires a finer eye, but I think it's also just really important.
Yeah, I think what both of you are kind of drawing on is just the amount of nuance and time that doing this work takes. Just hearing these things, I'm kind of thinking this would be a really great exercise to do with administrators to kind of illustrate the resources needed to do this kind of work, because it is extremely time consuming. It takes a lot of consideration of all the additional context that you need to really account for. So yeah, I think it's great that folks are picking up on this. Any other thoughts?
So we debated the Panicky too, and it kind of started talking about like, do we want, I suggested oppressive response, because I'm like, I don't want it to be about the actors. I want it to be about the folks who actually endured this. So, you know, so there's that question too. We're talking about that and trying to change the language in that way as well. But other people in the group were asking questions like, I don't know if that's the right term, because I'm not absolutely sure what the collection's about, because we didn't really have a lot of time to, you know, obviously if we saw it, we could have looked at the inventory list a little bit more, but or the box list, but we didn't have time. But so there was that question too, like really, I think what Matthew's getting at too, about the context of what is this stuff really, and should I be using this term, or should I be heavy-handed with this particular term? So yeah, but it's funny, we were talking about Panicky quite a bit too.
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we actually performed all of these revisions remotely. So we did not have access to the material. I think we ended up revising 50 catalog records and finding aids. But just the thought of paging all that material and looking through those collections would have entailed so much more time than we already spent. And I think it was about a year and a half that we spent on this project. So I think, you know, that is a very good consideration. We did end up paging a few things once we got back in the library, because sometimes you just need to be able to see the material itself. I think especially when it's not apparent if things are official titles of works or transcribed captions. So I think in those cases, it's helpful to see the material. Of course, it would be helpful to see the material for everything you're revising, but I think at the end of the day, if that amount of time is going to prohibit you from actually doing the work, I think making those revisions without viewing the material, I think, can work. You just need to be mindful of exceptions to that process. All right, I think we have about another minute before we'll go into our second breakout group, but was there any other impressions, thoughts, challenges folks wanted to share?
I mean, we replaced easily the group 2, the relocation with the removal, forced removal type of thing, but the plight and the panic response was a little discussion. And it sounded like a panic response, like a hiding the natural cause of the reaction, but it was kind of like a kind of agreeable, or like, well, naturally Pearl Harbor happened and this is happening also. I think it's kind of like a textbook approach, us versus them, you know, like we won, they lost. And the person who's describing this is a learned behavior, learned from elementary school to college education as an American values and a national patriot, maybe that kind of history education is forgiving or naturally producing this kind of terminology too.
Yeah, I think that's another important consideration, just the context of where the description's coming from, who's creating the description. All right, so we're going to go into the second breakout group now, and here you'll be adding the standardized descriptive notes to the finding aid. So in the instruction sheet, you'll see that there's a link out to that standardized descriptive notes tab on the LibGuide. So you'll use that to formulate those notes.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and I apologize. I didn't start recording I missed what you said, Matthew, on the paper. I'm sorry. But I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to press the breakout rooms icon, and it's supposed to sort us all back into the rooms we're in. We'll see if that works. Okay, so
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. All right, I'll just do the same thing I did earlier and share my screen with you all to kind of go over the way that we handled adding standardized notes to this finding aid. So we added the processing information note, which is mostly taken from that first boilerplate note in the documentation. But something else that I actually kind of just realized in the course of doing this workshop is that it would have been helpful to add this additional language about the finding aid containing original descriptive language, because we do retain that official title of a government agency, which includes non-preferred terminology. So I think it's, we could add that language in there. And then we also have the revision statement here. So in terms of the biog hist note, which I know my group was kind of talking about, well, does the collection warrant one? I know that it's a little hard to tell based on this doc, which is just a kind of snippet of the finding aid. I don't know if you all looked at that original PDF of the finding aid, but I think if you look at it, it's pretty apparent that it is just kind of a portion and not a majority of the collection. I know there was some discussion in my group about adding biog hist notes at lower levels, like at a scope and contents level. I don't think that there's any harm in doing that. I think we probably just didn't do that at Yale because that's not usually standard practice to add biog hist notes at lower levels beyond the collection level. But again, I would say that if it feels like it would be helpful to add additional context at lower levels of description, I can't see that doing any harm. So I'll stop sharing and ask folks to share a little bit about how that second part of the process went.
So in our group, we actually were questioning about where to put the revision statement, and if it would make sense to put it up at the top with, the collection overview section, and if there was any other like missing, like, when was this accession and stuff like that, like would it all go up there too? So I just wanted to mention that discussion that we had.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I know at least here in archive space, the way that we have it set it up, I don't know if it's similar at other institutions, but the notes are automatically sorted based on the way we standardize the order of display. So that is a good question. I think I did kind of look into the actual order and put it in there, but I feel like in the real world application, the order would be automated to some degree.
We put it at the top too, because we put the processing note closer to the arrangement note. And also because it's kind of I wouldn't call it a trigger warning, but it is letting you know from the very get-go that there could be harmful language in it. So we just thought it should be surfaced to the top. But yeah, there's those other problems. And also I stand to be corrected. I think it was in the MARC record that you put, there was a historic note put and not in the finding aid. And I said, oh, I think it should go in there. And it was in the MARC record that was in. So I stand to be corrected with the group that I was in. But we did debate whether that should be in there, whether we should provide some historic context, not knowing who the user of the finding aid might be and their knowledge of history, American history. So, you know, and then we also discussed like maybe that should be further down in the section of the collection that it may be relevant to. So that was also discussed in the group.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Heather. Are there other folks who want to share how the process went? I'd also be interested in maybe folks sharing about some potential challenges you could see in implementing these workflows at your own institution.
Could I actually just ask a real quick question? So you had mentioned that you collectively did this during, I'm assuming, the pandemic. Did you have trouble with standardizing the way that you all approached it, or was there some way that you felt like it was I don't even know exactly what I'm asking, except that if you have lots of people doing the same thing, did you worry about things not being done in the same manner?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I guess just in terms of consistency, we did make like a a work checklist document for the workflow. So basically just making sure that everyone was hitting the same steps. But obviously the way that people interpret redescription is going to vary based person to person. I think that's just true of all archival descriptions. So, you know, we have the resources that we created, like the preferred terminology guide and the style guide, but I think that is a good foundation. But obviously, amongst a team of folks, you'll have some variation in how people interpret those guidelines. We didn't do any sort of extensive like review or quality control before we published, other than, you know, we did distribute the list of records to the individual repositories because these records pulled from 4 different repositories at Yale. And I don't think we got any suggested revisions back. But yeah, I think just to answer your question, I think there will be variation, and I think that's kind of just part of the process. All right, so if there are no more kind of comments on the second part of the working group, I'll just pause for a second. Okay. I will just share those list of resources that I had referenced earlier in the presentation real quick. I've definitely gotten some feedback that there's so many different components to this work. So obviously in this 90 minutes, we were just focused on doing the actual workflow, but there are many different aspects of doing reparative description work. In a previous workshop, I had drafted a project plan template to help people kind of plan out in a systematic way how to approach a reparative description project. There's really great resources that some of my colleagues have done on advocacy and kind of the work of getting started. And I've just included some other case studies and resources and articles, which I think are kind of a helpful way to build a foundation in approaching the work. So we have about
Jessica, can
Yeah.
just I'm very interested in a number of the things that were in that previous slide. Will you be sharing those links with the attendees, since we can't really
Yes.
tell from the slide how to access them?
Yes, thank you
Great,
for
thank
asking.
you.
I was just about to here. I'll just stop sharing and we'll share with you the slides and the LibGuide, which you all were referencing. And there's also a survey on there, which is really helpful for me if folks are able to take the time to fill that out. I really appreciate your feedback and always take people's suggestions into consideration. So if you had the time to do that, I'd really appreciate it. So now we have about 15 minutes left for questions. So happy to answer. Amy.
Yeah, when you mentioned before sort of envisioning challenges, I feel like in any archives operation, there's always trying to figure out between going back to collections that are processed and moving forward with collections that need to be processed. And I would just be really interested to know sort of what time Yale is setting aside for the reparative work. How often does your group meet? You know, do you sort of how do you decide what you're going to do, and then you know, how do you evaluate that, I guess, are my big questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is something I definitely would have liked to get into if we had more time today. But yes, I always try to mention that obviously we're in a very privileged position of having a dedicated working group of full-time staff working on reparative description work. We started the task force with, I believe, 5 people on the group, and then had some exterior consultative members. Now I believe we have 8 or 9 people on the group, and we meet once a month, but we are also working kind of asynchronously on different projects. In terms of deciding on the scoped topical work we do, I talked a little bit about the rationale for why we chose the first subject area. We do want to continue to do scoped topical work because we find it really helps us kind of refine our workflows. And obviously we want to be attentive to concerns that users are bringing to us in terms of descriptions. So what we are trying to focus on doing right now is taking kind of a more data-driven, user-centered approach to deciding our next scope topical areas. So we're doing some user studies. We are soliciting feedback from users, and we're talking to our curatorial research and education department, as well as all the public services staff throughout special collections, to kind of interview them and learn about concerns that patrons have brought to them. So that's kind of how we're trying to approach moving forward, is trying to take like a step back and look at the bigger picture in terms of how what user search habits are and what our researcher community is identifying as a priority, and hopefully leading our work based on that. Bree, you had a question?
Hi, yeah, and I'm sorry if I missed this at the beginning, but was there a controlled vocabulary that you used with the community preferred terms, or was this decided within the working group, or kind of how did you make those decisions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. When you say controlled vocabulary, are you referring to like an official controlled vocabulary that we drew from, or?
Yes, like I know in similar works, in similar projects, like there's the I think there's the Homosaurus, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
If you consulted anything like that.
Yeah, so we had actually chosen to reach out to the two community groups that we worked with because they had formulated different resources that were basically advocating for a change in the way we describe Japanese American incarceration. So we had reached out to those groups because we knew that they had already put the work in to create that resource. And then the way that we wanted to approach that collaboration was figure out a way for them to consult on how those resources would translate to recommendations for archival description. So we created the resource internally, and then we had them review it and offer feedback. And it was kind of important for us to not just go to them and ask, can you create this resource for us? Because obviously they had already put the work into creating that. And we felt like we could do the work on our end to translate it into a resource for archival redescription. So yeah, and I know people are also really interested in hearing about like what that time commitment on their end looked like. So I think we ended up just having like a 1 hour meeting with each group, and then we had some continued communication via email of them just reviewing the resource, offering some feedback, and us making some final revisions to that before we move forward with the redescription. Yeah, thanks for that question. Any other questions? Matthew.
And this is sort of a big question, but I'm just thinking about what you asked earlier about sort of how would we apply this in our own institutions. And I think in my institution, a lot of what we're struggling with is just all the stuff that's hidden. You know, it's not necessarily, I mean, I don't want to say there's no offensive language in the description, but it's much more about euphemism. So for example, we have, you know, collections that have blackface performances, you know, things like that. And so in a lot of cases, there may not be any description of that at all. And if there is, it's very kind of safe, you know, kind of euphemistic. It's like controversial or something. And it's like, I'd like to say, you know, racist images, warning, racist images in, you know, in this collection or something like that. So that's a very, it seems like that's a different aspect than like replacing offensive terms. So I'm just sort of throwing that out there as that's something that's very much in my mind, and, you know, trying to think about how to address that, you know.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of conversations happening at Yale right now in terms of how we display images in the digital library that may be harmful or offensive. And obviously it's, you know, not too beneficial just to have a text disclaimer if you're already confronted with the image. So I know that they're exploring looking into like a click-through process in which the image is blurred and you're kind of confronted with a statement and you consent to click through. I've heard, you know, many different ways that people are thinking about this. I think, yeah, visual images, especially within a digital context, presents a special set of challenges and considerations. But I think just to get to your point about kind of not really knowing where to look or where things are, and, you know, often we get contacted because things get requested for digitization and they didn't even, know that they were there. And then all of a sudden they're confronted with how to contextualize that. So I think what's been helpful for us and why we're kind of focused on trying to collaborate with more front-facing staff is to just get the word out to our patrons and our user community that this is something we're working on, and it is something that they can bring to our attention, and that we will I think just being as transparent as possible about how we are thinking about and prioritizing work is at least an indication that we are thinking about it. We're thinking about how to approach it.
Matthew, that came up yesterday too, in the breakout room, and just the discussion, like even with the collection we're looking at, maybe there's things we would want to surface in that collection, but we don't know it. And yeah, I mean, it is quite subjective, but I do think you're right, because some of the older finding aids, probably the focus is quite different than what it might be if we were to write it today. So I think but it's just so time consuming, as Jessica's suggesting. But to me, like, that's such important work to do otherwise. And yes, maybe our users can help us. Otherwise, that stuff probably won't see the light of day, and people won't know it's there for trigger warning, but also just for research purposes, that they might not know it's there. And I don't know, it's so frustrating to me. That part of it's the most frustrating because it's so time consuming. And with minimal processing, are we ever gonna, if it's like a small part of the collection, are we really gonna see it? Probably not.
And for us also, the flip side of that is providing more description of, the positive aspects, the things that are in the collections that we want to call to people's attention that are just not described at all,
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Matthew. And maybe something that is not talked about in the context of reparative description is under description, and kind of enabling that that access and highlighting material. So yeah, I definitely don't have the answers for that, but I'm hoping that will come more into the conversation.
Is there any other questions? We're almost we have about 5 minutes left in the workshop.
I don't know if anyone is willing to share, but we, as part of RAD, are always really interested in putting our documentation out there, because we know that there are folks who don't have the capability to dedicate a group of people to work on reparative description. So we are hopeful that if there are folks who are looking to get started, that our documentation could maybe be a starting point. So if you have any ideas about what is actually helpful for us to put out there, to promote it, to kind of facilitate other people doing that work, I'd love to hear your ideas.
Thank you so much, Jessica. But no one else has any other questions. I want to thank Jessica so much, and the work of the team and the sharing of these resources. I think they're amazing. And I didn't really know much about them until after this workshop, and we will be sure to use them. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for attending. There's a clap. Oh, it's not a hand. Thank you everyone for attending. And I just want to let you know about a few upcoming PACSCL workshops. We have Nicholas Reinhardt, who's a postdoc at Dartmouth, and he will be speaking about reparative semantics. So it might be a little bit more about, I don't know, it could potentially even be a little controversial, I will tell you that. So please join us on June 7th for that. And then Alexander Ames at the Rosenbach will be speaking about community building. So that community outreach piece that Jessica did talk about, but I think he's going to talk even more about that. And that's on June 22nd. We will be sending out sort of save the date emails to let you know about the time it's usually around 3, but we'll be sending them out just to make sure that you know about it, and hopefully you'll attend. Thank you everyone so much. And thank you, Jessica. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone, for participating and being such great sports. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Bye.